Okay, this is History 1302, a lecture on Reconstruction, the end of the Lincoln administration and the beginning of the Andrew Johnson administration. Well, as we come into the post-Civil War era, it's fair to remember a few things about Lincoln and his administration, what he could and could not do as president. Abraham Lincoln was a prominent man, and of course he's president of the United States. Lincoln he was, to talk about the major issue of his day and, of course, his presidency, which is the issue of slavery and its causation of the war and prolonging of the war and all those sorts of things there. I think it's fair to remember that Lincoln he was against slavery. However, Lincoln was also somewhat complicated on the issue of slavery, and in fact, it might say that he was very political on the issue of slavery. At the outset of the Civil War, before the Civil War, frankly, Abraham Lincoln made it clear when he was nothing more than a Whig politician in Illinois that he was opposed to the institution of slavery. Yet, as his star began to rise in the 1850s and finally culminating with his nomination as the Republican champion for president in 1860, Lincoln also made it clear, too, that he was opposed to slavery, yet he was not willing to destroy it where it existed. What Lincoln had hoped to do, and there were others like him, and Lincoln had chased some other ideas such as colonization of the freedmen or slaves in the early 1850s, late 1840s. But one of the things you'll see with Lincoln as he's running for president in 1860 is he says fairly clearly, and he had been saying for some time, that slavery should not be allowed to expand. And when we talk about slavery and the coming of the Civil War, it's the main cause. But one of the things you need to understand, too, is that it became an article of dogmatic faith with especially the more rabid elements of the pro-slavery movement, who are oftentimes called fire eaters. Those fire eaters said, and others less rabid, but at the same time as strident, somewhat as strident as the fire eaters, with regard to the issue, they would say that slavery must not be fettered. Slavery must not be hemmed in. Slavery must not be stopped. That slavery wasn't just something we had to do and something we had to have for labor. And you'll see those sorts of arguments in the era of the Founding Fathers. But by the time you get to the Civil War, and frankly even 30 years before, you'll hear the argument change amongst the pro-slavery crowd from slavery as a necessary evil to quote John C. Calhoun, a positive good. And so by the time you get to 1860, many slavery folks had pro-slavery folks in the South and even what we consider the South and what we would consider the North, say Kentucky, and elsewhere were saying that if slavery is a positive good, why must it be restricted anywhere? And you'll see versions of that take place, and that was a real worry, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes real, by Northerners, that slavery would not just go into the territories, say in Arizona, New Mexico, south of that very famous 3630 parallel across the country, but it would go north into Nebraska. It would go north into Oregon. It would go north into even Massachusetts, because the implications of various laws and statements and directives by the Congress, by fire eaters, by presidents who were dough-faced, which is a term from the era, but dough-faced and had many Southern supporters, was that slavery needed to go wherever it wanted to go. And so for a lot of Northerners, that radicalizes them and pushes them into a position of, well, we've got to stand and fight, to use an overworked phrase in politics nowadays. And so it helps radicalize the northern population, and Southerners are going on to say, and they're radicalizing too in the 1850s, especially as you get toward 1860. They're radicalizing too that whenever any northern politician says, you know what, slavery is not right, slavery is not okay, and slavery is frankly evil or wrong, and it needs to be stopped, it needs to be hemmed in, then that was a tantamount to saying that slavery needed to be removed everywhere. So I'm clear about this. Like I said, Lincoln was not, at the outset of his presidency, was not in favor of ripping slavery up root and branch everywhere. Frankly, Lincoln was looking for other ways to go after slavery. He was opposed to it, but you don't have to go for the most extreme position right away. He was looking for a more lenient method. And so what Lincoln's going to do is he will say slavery cannot expand. And so that was part of the reason the Southerners leave. When he was elected, they understood that slavery, as far as Lincoln was concerned, at least for a 4-year period, was not going to be allowed to expand past its borders. But there was a radicalization underway in the South. The war happens. Now, Lincoln, as president, is looking for other ways to get at slavery without just frankly, ripping it out root and branch immediately. Quite frankly, when we talk about the emancipation of slaves in other parts of the world, especially the Western world, you'll see the emancipation of slaves take place in a more gradual method. But especially not just gradual, it'll take place and it will be done in a compensated manner. So I think you need to understand that Lincoln was very much in favor of compensated emancipation. Compensated emancipation, which means is that the slave owners would be paid paid a wage by the government, normally in the form of bonds, maybe a direct cash payment, but the bond could be sold for cash anyways. But basically would be paying the slave owner to emancipate their slaves, and in some schemes the recolonization of the slaves, meaning sending them back to Africa, was the idea. Liberia was the American position. But the fact of the matter is that even as late as 1864, northern states, as I've said before to you, there were some northern states that had slavery, such as Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware. Delaware had the least by far because it's a very small state, but they all had slavery. Most of those states were, even as late as 64, were not in favor of even compensated emancipation. So as the war drags on, Lincoln's views on slavery are moving from a gradual, first of all, from a position of hem slavery in and don't let it get any further, kind of like you wall off a tumor, or you wall off a virus or whatever. You wall off something that is bad. You wall it off, but you don't go in there and rip it out. And then to the compensated emancipation, he sends up those trial balloons in various ways. I use the Kentucky, Maryland example because he has a meeting with those representatives that fails. But he also tries it in occupied Louisiana, and it's not going anywhere. The issue of slavery, particularly in many southern quarters, and I'm talking about leadership now, southern leadership, elite leadership, those who own slaves in some number, those who are very cozy with those who did, but yet were also leaders. The issue of slavery became something that they could not turn loose of. Even if it became something, kind of a touchstone that they were, the proverbial hill they were prepared to die on, and some literally will do that because of the war. So as the war drags on, back to Lincoln, he's going to move from that gradual emancipation and compensated emancipation to the Emancipation Proclamation, which also, as we know, affected the southern states, or was directed toward the southern states and not those other states. As I might have said to you once before, it's important to remember about the president. His power is... His power, especially in the 19th century, far more so than today. The president today is a very powerful position, but it was powerful in Lincoln's time period. But Lincoln's power was enhanced greatly by the war. And that's because the president he's vested with commander-in-chief powers. And when there is a war on, it necessarily works this way, with maybe a notable exception or so. But normally when there's a war on, the president becomes a very powerful, even more powerful figure in American politics than normal, and Congress recedes into the background. You need to put that second part in your notes. Congress will recede into the background, at least somewhat. They'll try to hold on. You've got dominant figures in the Congress. But Lincoln, because of the war, has wide latitude in commander-in-chief powers. Where is the rebellion? And that's part of the proclamation. It's a very legal document. It's not soaring rhetoric for the most part. It is not something you remember as like his inaugural addresses, which were both soaring. Of course, the very famous Gettysburg Address, and Lincoln wrote lots of things over his career. But the fact of the matter is, when we talk about Lincoln and his great words, the emancipation is important because basically he takes and he realizes the limitations he still has. He can take the emancipation to the South because those are the states that are in rebellion. Those are the states where he's using his military power as commander-in-chief to quash the rebellion, to crush the rebellion. And one of the ways you go about doing that is depriving the rebels, the Southerners, of contraband and property, and to take away their ability to wage war and rebellion against the U.S. government, which is an unlawful act. So anyways, and of course the Southerners would say, especially at the outset, would they say that slavery is property, or slaves are property. So when I use the term slave and contraband, that was a phrase that was used by Union General Benjamin Butler, was adopted to some degree by the Lincoln administration, and basically was a way to help defund and to break the back of the rebellion by taking away the rebels' slaves, which would help, so we're clear, not just to produce product in the fields, such in the form of cotton and foodstuffs, which is certainly true. But also it's fair to remember too, and I believe I might have said this in another lecture, is that the Confederacy was assisted, the Confederate armies were assisted. Lee's army, the Western armies, but both in general, were assisted by slaves who were brought into the army by their masters, or were loaned to or rented or leased to the army and the government to act as porters, to act as nurses, to act as basically logistical agents who can load up wagons, and who can carry the baggage, and who can move this and that. Basically what it does is it frees up men who would have been otherwise in the rear with the gears, they used to say, but would have been in the rear echelons, the quartermaster or the logistical echelons, and you can move them up to artillery, cavalry, or particularly infantry. Those men can now be moved up, so it helps the Confederate war effort to fight the war. You take away the slaves, it may not outright cripple the Confederacy, but it would certainly damage them greatly. And so Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is limited because of his war power, but it isn't completely limited either, because he is fighting and trying to crush a rebellion. And the reason it does not appear, this emancipation does not go to the North and is not put into effect in Kentucky or Missouri or whatever, because the war is not in Kentucky for all intents and purposes. Yes, there's some battles in Kentucky. I'm well aware of that. And I know there's a major and a famous battle at Sharpsburg, Maryland, in Pennsylvania. But none of those states left the Union. None of those states went into rebellion. Even if there was battle there, the federal courts still were operational in those states. And on top of that, if Lincoln tries to extend his reach into to emancipate slaves into Kentucky, he's got to deal with a political fallout that maybe Kentucky or Missouri might try to, especially early on, bolt the Union and go with the Confederacy. Maryland especially would be a problem because of the geography of Washington, D.C. That would be one. Not only is it a political problem, two, a legal problem would be as if Lincoln tries to extend an Emancipation Proclamation into those northern states. Then you've got the issue of the Supreme Court, which was headed by a guy named Roger Taney, who was he was a Democrat, and he hated Lincoln, and he was sympathetic to the Southerners, yet he had owned slaves and had emancipated them, was from Maryland, and he was looking for ways to clip Lincoln's wings. Not necessarily cause the loss of the war, I don't think, but at the same time, Roger Taney would have taken it as his personal goal to bring Lincoln down to size just a little bit. So Lincoln's got to look over his shoulder, as it were, at the Supreme Court and try to keep them in check and not have them call into question his executive orders. And I want to say something too is that Lincoln, like President Jackson beforehand, were not particularly sold on the absolute idea that the Constitution is solely interpreted by the Supreme Court. Over time, that has become the standard and received wisdom is that I flippantly or snarkily say in class when I teach the Constitution, I ask the question, what does the Constitution say? And the answer in this sarcasm is whatever the Supreme Court says it says. But President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s in the Bank War veto message, and also later President Lincoln in some of his actions in the Civil War, are going to argue quite stridently that the Supreme Court is not the supreme branch of the government, and they don't get a unilateral and a exclusive right to interpret the meaning of the Constitution. Neither Jackson nor Lincoln were claiming for themselves a exclusive right to interpret the Constitution for themselves, but basically they would say is that the Supreme Court is one of three co-equal branches, not the supreme branch of the government. So those sorts of ideas of the Supreme Court being unimpeachable, and I don't mean that like literally removing people from office, but their judgment is unimpeachable. You should not question their ability to review the Constitution exclusively and certainly finally. The fact of the matter is that in the 19th century, it was the Supreme Court was not thought of nearly as much as it is today. It was not considered to be this august body of great sages and savants from the law, who can give kind of like philosophers on a mountain who can send up a smoke signal, and we all have to gather around the mountain to see what they have to say. Like you get today. And I say that as a jab at both wings of the political establishment, both conservatives and Republicans, and also Democrats who basically camp out at the Supreme Court, especially waiting for their great words. But in the 19th century, that was not nearly the case. And Congress in the 19th century was much more prominent, stronger, assertive than it is today. Congress today, for the most part in 2020, is a flaccid organization. Its institutional pride is nowhere to be found. And so, but Lincoln, as the war goes on, Lincoln is going to assert more and more commander-in-chief authority because the war is getting wider in the sense that the Union Army goes further into the South. And so the further the Army goes and the more the U.S. government occupies rebel states, the more, in the case of emancipation, it can be affected as more and more slaves run to the Union Army for freedom and so forth. Some of you may be thinking, why would and I may have already brought this up to you, but it bears repeating. But some of you may be thinking, that you were taught and told that the Civil War wasn't just about slavery. And I will go so far as to agree that the Civil War isn't just about slavery, but it is, to me, the hub issue. It's the central issue by which everything else revolves around. And so this next part gets into the issue of Reconstruction, and it's a little preview, a little foreshadowing of what we would now call as the lost cause, the myth of the lost cause. The thing to remember is that when we talk about the lost cause, the southern states after the war is over, and especially after about a 10 to 15-year period, are going to start to write, and these ex-Confederate officers, these ex-Confederate politicians, chiefly the famous one is Jefferson Davis, but they're going to start writing memoirs and essays and articles about the Confederacy and what it meant to be a Confederate officer and so forth. Some of it is just pure memoir writing in the sense like they were in my time in the Army sort of thing. And then others have an avowedly open desire after the war is over to write a version of the history, as it were. And what you normally get, and I'll probably repeat this again in a later lecture, but what you normally get is a view of the Confederacy that is fairly benign. And what you get out of it is the answer of, we fought this war not for slavery, but we fought it for liberty and our rights to defend our rights and so forth. And I don't doubt that there are some individuals, especially the lower echelons of the Confederacy and the Confederate armies, the rank and file men, most of whom, by the way, did not own slaves. If you are under the impression from high school or just common knowledge sort of thing, the received wisdom of the country right now is that most Confederates and most Southerners, especially white Southerners, owned slaves, you would be gravely mistaken. Only about a quarter of white Southerners at the outbreak of the Civil War owned slaves, and very few, I think it's about 2 or 3%, as I recall, owned 20 or more slaves, that planter class stuff. So the vast majority of white Southerners do not own slaves, and the number of slaves owned by a slave owner is about 1. It's fractionally over. But anyways, when it comes to the Civil War, many of those guys are going to fight for various reasons. Many of those common men will fight for because you're invading my homeland. My state went out, this, that, and the other. And some will fight with the implicit understanding that they're fighting for the institution of slavery because they too may wish to become a slave owner at one point in time. They may desire to achieve that position. Maybe not planter class, which is like saying I wish to become a very wealthy man and live in River Oaks. I say use River Oaks or Highland Park, but you want to become a wealthy man. Who doesn't? But most people realize that's not in the cards for them. But when it comes to the elites of the South, and they're the ones who call the shots, they're the ones who are going to lead the South out in 1860 and 61 with those secession conventions. Their words in 1859, 1860, 1861 tell a very different story than the words they're going to write in 1875 or 1880 in hindsight. And that's what I would have you to write down. So what was the cause of the Civil War? I think, especially from the Northern perspective, they fought the Civil War for two reasons, particularly, meaning like the Lincoln level, the presidential level, the congressional level, the leadership level. You're fighting the Civil War for two reasons. One is to first initially, and then also throughout the war, to save the Union. Keep the country from busting up. You cannot leave. Secondly, the other issue that's going to be out there is the issue of slavery. And so it depends on who you're talking about, depends on the dates and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, the issue of the Civil War is still about, for Northerners, is going to be about slavery. Now, some people will say slavery must be stopped because it has caused so much trouble, yet they weren't exactly keen on the idea of complete equality. Other abolitionists would say yes, yes, and yes. It also bears repeating, too, with regard to the North, that many Northerners, I say Northerners, but say Lincoln and his administration Lincoln's going to explicitly say, and he's a lawyer and he's a president, so he's got a big voice, he's going to say that secession is illegal. A state cannot leave. We talked on that in an earlier lecture, probably. The thing is that for Southerners, back to them, in 1859, 1860, and 1861, as the issue of slavery gets bigger and bigger, and the issue of secession and disunion and the crack-up of the Union is looming larger and larger, and it's coming. You can kind of see it really in 59 and 60, especially after Lincoln is elected. Those Southern states are going to, for the most part, call what are known as secession conventions, and these conventions are going to put out pieces of paper. Why are we leaving the Union? You don't just announce you're leaving and run out the door, and some people might do that, but that's not how real people really run things. You don't just say, I'm gone, and get out the door. You say why we're leaving. You're in 1860 and 61. You're trying to wrap yourself in perhaps the best angle. Why are we leaving? And they do talk about liberty in 60 and 61 in those conventions about their reasons to leave, but it always comes back to, and it's said in several various ways, but it is my liberty to wring the sweat, or my liberty to own another man and wring his sweat out and get labor from him so it can enrich me. You see it again and again in, say, Mississippi or Texas or any of those other southern states that go out. They'll dress it up other ways, but when they talk about liberty in 60 and 61, it's the issue of my ability to own another man. That's the liberty they talk about, and you don't hear arguments of states' rights so much. You don't hear the arguments of this and that, what you see later on. So what I would have you to remember, and this is the way I teach this subject, is that if you really want to get a feel for why the Civil War occurs from the Southern perspective, especially amongst the leadership class, the planter class, the governors and senators and congressmen territory, the elite class, you go read what they wrote in those secession conventions. We're leaving for these reasons here, and it oftentimes talks about liberty and the liberty to own slaves to maintain my lifestyle. So it's about slavery and how you cannot do away with that. And then some would go, like I said, others would go further and say it cannot be corralled at all, and on from there. So that's what I'd have you to remember, is that those are major issues in the war, and the war settles them. May have been remarked by a student once before, is that in essence, you can talk all the legalisms you want and all the reasons why, but the matter is that the South lost the Civil War on the battlefield and the North won it, and that's right. Now, the thing will be when we talk about Reconstruction is that the South might have won Reconstruction and the North lost that. And so we keep that in the back of our mind. It may be a true historical statement or mixed with some truth and some not, I don't say falsehood like I'm lying, but it just may not be a correct analysis. I think that's probably right, though. The North won the Civil War, the South won the Reconstruction. Because ultimately, when you talk about Reconstruction, at the end of the day, the North pulls out of the South in 1876 or so, 1877, and they're going to pull away and leave the South more or less alone for the next next 75 years with regard to race and race issues and race relations and those sorts of things there. And then you eventually start to see segregation and riots and what have you. So, Lincoln is worn down by the war, and as we've said, there's a lot of death and destruction. Lincoln is worn down by the war, and in Abraham Lincoln's case, this nearly killed him. If you look at presidents who've been in the White House, most men who are president and they take it really seriously, and some people handle stress better than others. You start to see them gray out, their hair turns white, and that was certainly true. It's in your lifetime, if you'd have seen President Obama in 2008 when he won the election in 2009 when he took the oath of office to when he left office in 2017, President Obama had quite a bit more gray hair in his head than when he came in. Some of it has to do with the fact that he went from being about a 48-year-old man to about a 56-year-old man. But the stress of the office will gray a person out. You see this with Franklin Roosevelt. It nearly kills Woodrow Wilson, the World War does. James K. Polk, it's dramatic in 4 years how much he worked himself to death. He really literally killed himself in the White House. He dies a few months after leaving the White House of, scarlet fever or something like that. But he was a spent shell, and he was in the 1840s. But Lincoln, if you look at pictures of Lincoln when he goes into the presidency in 60 and 61, he's got that full face and he looks healthy and so forth. Big, tall man, of course. But then you look at Lincoln at the end of the war, right before he dies, and then of course you see the gaunt face and the lines everywhere, and he looks like a worn out man. Now, I'm not saying he was on death's doorstep. Who knows? He was actually, of course, he was soon to die, and we know that. But Lincoln is he's worn out by the presidency, but he's still got 4 years. In 1864, Lincoln wins re-election. There was some speculation, even in the late summer of '64, that Lincoln would lose, the Democrats would win, and the country would eventually bust up because the Democrats would not continue the war. Fair to remember, too, is that if the Democrats went up north in 1864, and they end up getting a lot of votes anyways, but in a lot of those Southerners, those Confederates, they are old Democrats. Most of them were not Whigs. None of them, or basically none of them, were Republicans, and had they been Republicans, they would have gone north. Well, anyways, all of which is to say is that Lincoln wins in 64, wins comfortably. It's not a full-on landslide, but he wins comfortably, and very comfortably in 64. And Lincoln is looking to the future about what to do, what's it going to be like, and so on. So the question is, what do you do after you win the war? I mean, at some point, the thoughtful administration, the thoughtful president, the thoughtful entourage around the president are going to start asking the question of what happens when we win this war. And what do we do? How do we bring the South back in? And over time, I have posed to students the question, what do you do? Do you charge the Southern officers with treason and this and that and take away their property and what have you? And as I have said before, perhaps, that is not an easy nut to crack. Treason has a very high threshold to prove. You have to have multiple witnesses to the same act. Waging, in the phrase in the Constitution, is waging war against the United States of America. The problem is with Lincoln in 64 or 65, when the war comes to an end at Appomattox and Durham Station, is that did the Southern states wage war against the United States? Obviously, there was an armed rebellion. I mean, there's no denying that fact. I mean, you have Lee and Joseph Johnston surrendering their respective armies, and they were armed and in uniform. So there is that. It is an armed rebellion. But Lincoln clearly says time and time again that the Southern states could not leave. They did not leave. And the Confederacy was legally, again, back to this lawyer talk, the Confederacy was legally a non-entity. It was extra-legal, meaning it was outside the law, illegal. It could not occur. And so only nations can wage war against other nations. And so you see there's a problem right there on the treason charge. The treason charge is also hard to prove because, or at least not hard to prove, well, it'd be kind of hard to prove, but it would certainly be hard to convict. And that's the bigger issue, is conviction, not necessarily proof. It'd be hard to convict Davis and especially a Lee or some of these other leaders because the Constitution, which you're fighting, had fought and killed and defended. It also says is that a trial has to take place in the district, in the territory in the district where the offense occurred. And the offense occurred in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital, because that's going back to English common law, actually. It occurred in Virginia at Richmond. And so you're going to have a trial in Richmond, Virginia of Robert E. Lee, unless you just basically drug a bunch of soldiers in and sat them down. It's not, and made it just a simple pro forma trial, a kangaroo court sort of operation, unless you're going to play that game. And a lot of Americans were not excited about that sort of prospect, and it would frankly make you a little bit of a hypocrite to argue and say the Constitution matters, and then you go off and you mess around with due process and criminal rights like that. You're not, if you have any sort of representative jury out of Virginia, you're not going to get a conviction of Robert E. Lee. And as I've said also, Robert E. Lee may have had a defense to his actions, because the thing is, how can you be, you talk about, waging war against the United States, and it would be, the idea would be a citizen waging war against the United States for treason. But the problem is the Constitution is in 1865 is silent on the issue of citizenship. It never defines it really. Not until the 14th Amendment comes along in 68 do you actually get a definition of citizenship, and that's basically citizenship by birth sort of idea, natural born citizen. The thing is that Lee could plausibly say there's some legal shenanigans going on, don't get me wrong, but you hire a good lawyer, you're looking for all the legal techniques and tools and theories you can get your hands on. And so Lee is going to argue that, and others like him would argue, it's like, I'm a citizen of Virginia. So Virginia left, as best my understanding was, I had to go with my state, and I did. I mean, at the end of the day, as I have said, do I think Lee and the Southerners commit treason? Yeah, probably so. But at the same time, do they legally, meaning could be convicted and clearly proven that they committed treason? Well, that's higher than just an opinion to get done. So treason is not going to be very viable. Second thing that has been proposed, Southerners should have had all their territories taken away from them, their land taken away from them, and given to the slaves as reparations and so forth and so on. Again, you go back to the Constitution, which you're defending and you're trying to uphold. The Constitution makes it very plain that bills of attainder, or that's the word, bills of attainder, are not permissible under the Constitution. And a bill of attainder basically is the victor's way of punishing a loser in some sort of spat or war or rebellion. And so you can't just go off and just start jerking people's land away from them because they fought in the war. So you didn't have that tool available to break the Confederacy as far as the old leadership of the Confederacy. And so what Lincoln is going to argue for, and what Lincoln is going to argue for, keeping that all in the back of your mind, at least initially. We don't know exactly what he had done had he lived. But Lincoln is going to argue for what you can call in your notes a lenient Reconstruction. Now, you might as well put these two names in your notes, both of them Roman, and I can use a lot of different examples on the issue. What do you do with rebellion? Sometimes it is the way of man in a power sense is that, yeah, you do what you want to do and let the lawyers write the details after the fact. So I guess you could go down that route. But anyways, we like to think of ourselves as a nation of laws and constitutions, so it's kind of hard. But in the Roman sense, you have two examples very close to each other historically of what do you do with rebels to, in this case, a Caesar or a military chieftain. The first one is a guy named Sulla, S-U-L-L-A, Sulla. He was a military chieftain, and he had enemies, and he basically killed all his enemies or tried to do so. He was a cruel and capricious individual, nasty guy. And that's one way to crush your enemies, to kill them all, in a sense, or at least kill them all and imprison the others or beat them half to death. I mean, I was sitting there reading recently about the coming of the Third Reich in Germany, and that's what they're going to do with their political enemies, is they're going to either kill them, beat them, or drive them out of the country. But the Nazis were pretty bloodthirsty, like Sulla was. Opposite of that in Roman history is actually Julius Caesar for the most part. Now, Caesar was no softy overall. I'm not going to tell you that he was just as pacifistic as a Quaker. He's not. But when it comes to opposition to Caesar, Caesar does not get bloodthirsty like Sulla does, and ultimately it does cost him his life. You know the very famous phrase from Julius Caesar, at least you ought to, Shakespearean, et tu, Brute, and you, Brutus. And that was the stab in the back, and of course Caesar had been killed on the floor of the Roman Senate. And it starts the cult of Caesar. It begins the Caesarism in Roman history, and the rest is history. And you're going to get some other bloodthirsty cats coming along pretty quickly behind him, Caligula, Nero, etc. Well, anyways, all of which is to say is there's different methods of how do you handle the loser rebels. And Lincoln's going to choose them far more lenient route. You can see hints of this in Lincoln's inaugural address in 1865. You see hints of this elsewhere in actions and promulgations and who he picks and what he does. Lincoln is trying to accomplish several things. One, I think Lincoln is trying out of a tenderness of heart, Lincoln's not a hard man. He's not a Patton, and you don't have to go to Hitler to have a hard man, but you can find hard men in history who aren't Hitler or Stalin and say, yeah, in tough situation, the hard man comes, and you get the results of the hard actions, the tough actions, the cruel actions potentially. You got examples in American history like that, some better than others, but you have the hard man out there. I threw Patton. Now, Patton was a great general, but he could also be a hard man. Well, anyways, when we talk about Lincoln, I think he was for conciliation. And in a sense, I can't blame him. And I am going on about this, but I want you to remember that Lincoln and the whole North and the whole South have been convulsed in 3.5 years or so of 4 years of Civil War. I mean, it's a long period of time of war, of which is extraordinarily bloody. 660,000 individuals, that's combined, but North and South are going to die in this thing. And it's a much smaller nation than it is today. Today, 2020, you've got about 330 million Americans, somewhere in that neighborhood. In 1865, you're looking at about 30 to 32 million Americans. So the percentage of death is a lot higher. And so a lot of Americans have had their fill of blood, and they're not interested in more blood. And in that, I would argue, is to our credit that you did not just have this endless cycle of bloodletting where you completely decimated and just ruined, kept on killing until there was none to kill, as it were. So Lincoln, I think, was going with a lenient plan. And so I think that was the word lenient needs to be in your notes. And Lincoln is trying to get Reconstruction done with in a timely and a fast fashion. And what the Southerners have to do, it's pretty simple. So put this in your notes. This is Lincoln's plan of Reconstruction, his initial one. There seemed to have been some indications he was reconsidering this before he dies, but then, of course, he dies and we don't know. But Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, let me go ahead and drink this. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was basic. You got 4 points. All you have is 4, and that's it. Lincoln's 4 points for Reconstruction are pretty simple, and some of them you should already kind of have an idea is coming. If you think about what were the two major War aims of the Lincoln administration. Why does the North fight the Civil War? And if you're saying, well, they fought to free the slaves and they fought to save the Union, well, those are going to be two of the four right off the bat. So number one would be this. I'll just start with the first of those Northern war aims, meaning the ones that they started the war with. Why do we fight? Save the Union. So Lincoln, for the longest time, had said and had argued legally, publicly, and elsewhere that secession was illegal. So number one, therefore, Southern states, in order to rejoin the Union and be properly received once more, the Southern states had to say and had to admit, and you do this through a legislative body vote, but they have to say secession is illegal. They have to say that. That is something they have to admit to and cop to get them on record, as it were. That idea, the theory of secession, had died with the war. So that's number one. The second point of Lincoln's his second point of his Reconstruction plan was easy to remember as well. You may say emancipate the slaves in your notes, but that would be wrong. Do not write, so I'm clear, do not write emancipate the slaves. Write the word abolish. Abolish slavery. And that means ratify the 13th Amendment. Those Southern states, in order to get back in the good graces of Lincoln in the North, because they're the victors and the Southerners are the losers, the Southern states, in order to get back in the graces, have to abolish slavery by ratifying the 13th Amendment. You may say, why am I making a big deal about this? It is an important legal point that abolishing the institution of slavery is different than emancipating slaves. Abolishing of slavery as an institution emancipates the slaves. Emancipating the slaves does not abolish the legal institution of slavery. So, this is what I mean, is if you do not pass the 13th Amendment, if it's never put on the books, theoretically at least, you could have a reinstitution of slavery in a later time if you'd had a government that was so inclined. But when you pass the 13th Amendment abolishing the institution of slavery, and you just wipe it out and push it off and destroy it legally, then slavery, at least is that what we would call slavery, involuntary servitude, is gone. It's done. Legally, it's illegal. So it's out the door. Southern states had to do that. Number three, and now it gets a little more difficult, but they're frankly easy to remember. Number three is the issue of rebel debt. One of the things that all those rebel nations or rebel states will do, the Confederate government in Richmond, Virginia, is also going to do this as well. They are going to promote and to push and to sell bonds. They sell bonds to locals. They sell rebel bonds. I say rebel, but I mean Confederate bonds. Pieces of public debt in England and on the markets and so forth. They are trying to finance a war during their existence. But with the war over, what do you do with all that rebel debt? Because they're going to be men and women that are going to come to Richmond, Virginia, or they're going to go to Raleigh, North Carolina, or some other state capital and say, I've got these bonds and I need to be paid. I gave my money and I demand to be paid. Lincoln's answer was, no, you don't, because the Confederate government of Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, all et cetera and so forth, none of those states legally existed, and if they don't legally exist, they cannot legally issue debts and bonds, the treasury notes and such. In essence, you bought fake paper. And so those states, all those Confederate states, all that old Confederate money and that old Confederate bonds, they're worth nothing. They're null and void. Maybe the word you need to put in your notes, I've used this over the years, it's a good one. The word is, the Southern states must repudiate. They must repudiate the rebel debt, meaning it's almost like it has almost a force of throwing it up, basically push it away and deny it. I repudiate you. It's the denunciation of the debt. It has no bearing here. Get thee away from me, Satan, sort of thing. That's King James Version. But anyways, all of which is to say is, though, that's point number three, repudiate the rebel debt. And number four, hence the term the 10% plan of Reconstruction. That is historically we know their 10% plan. That way, the Lincoln's 10% plan of Reconstruction, put this in your notes, it is that 10% of the Southerners who participated in the war have to take a loyalty oath to the Constitution and the government, and that's that. If the Southern states do those things, those four things, it's over. Reconstruction ends quickly, and life can move back forward. But unfortunately for the country, Lincoln does die, and the results are quite calamitous, and you have a long Reconstruction of mixed success and, frankly, much failure in many places. And the reason we have that is because a fellow named John Wilkes Booth. And if you've never heard the story of John Wilkes Booth, and his conspiracy to kill the president, it is an interesting little story. Some of you on this watching this recording know it quite well because you have been to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and they tell it there. Maybe a few of you have been to Lincoln's burial plot in Illinois. I don't know. But anyway, John Wilkes Booth is a Southern sympathizer. He comes from a family of actors, and actors then as now have a bit of a reputation for being a bit flaky, flighty, eccentric, strange. But they are celebrities even in the 19th century. That's all true and good. Both Booth's brothers were famous Shakespearean actors. Booth's father was a very famous Shakespearean actor in America and had even some success in England. The Booth family were big-time actors, not unlike, say, think of the Douglas family, Kirk and Stephen Douglas, or the Eastwood family or something like that. Names that you hear and you're like, they're a bunch of actors, but great actors. That was the Booths. And John Wilkes had been for a long time a quiet and kind of surreptitious, clandestine supporter of the Confederacy. And so by the time you get to 1865, Booth is looking around and trying to figure out how to help the Confederacy. Because by the time you get to 1865, it's obvious the Confederacy is dying. It is losing the war. And so Booth had hatched a plan in early 1865, February territory there, with the idea of we need to abduct Lincoln and carry him and take him south to Richmond and compel the Union to sue for peace to get their president back, kind of a kidnapping and that sort of thing. The thing about John Wilkes Booth is he tended to attract around himself a bunch of nitwits, a bunch of zeros, and a bunch of half-wits. These guys are the sort of individuals that would make the Apple Dumpling Gang or the Keystone Cops look competent. Some of them are, just literally sycophants who are friends of Booth, who, because he's a famous actor, they hang on his every word. But they had hatched this plan, and as things deteriorate for the Southerners in April of 1865, to the point where Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse in 65, was it early April 65, Booth says the times call for stronger stuff. Basically, a kidnapping is not going to work. A kidnapping is not enough to save the Confederacy. We must have mass assassinations. And so Booth and his conspirators are going to launch an assassination, a set of assassination plots. Basically, what was supposed to happen was that these assassins were going to kill Lincoln, going to kill Johnson, going to kill Secretary of State Seward, Salmon P. Chase. I'm probably forgetting a few other secondary targets as well. But basically, in a sense, decapitate through assassination the head of the U.S. government, the Union government in Washington, D.C. Now, you may be thinking how hard, it must have been very hard to get to the president in that time period. The truth is, it wasn't. The president in 1865 and 1860, and this is true not just for Lincoln, but for most presidents, is that they had minimal protection. The Secret Service was embryonic. There really wasn't that much there wasn't that much guard. There aren't that many guards around the White House. If you really wanted to, you could go to the White House and ask to see the president. Now, you may not see him for very long, maybe a minute or two, but you could do that. the president walking the streets, maybe talking to a friend, but without any Secret Service detail or any bodyguards. That was common. You saw it with Lincoln. You saw it with Buchanan. You see it's going to see with others. It's all over the place. A very different time compared to today, where the president is in a security cocoon. And for obvious reasons, you got history that will kind of compel the United States to go down that road of putting this protective bubble around the president, as we have in 2020. Well, anyways, all that to say is Lincoln doesn't have that, and he kind of shrugs his shoulders and doesn't think people need to do that and worry about it. Lincoln was kind of blasé about his own security. Others would beg him to take a guard with him, beg him to arm himself, but at the same time, Lincoln just kind of, it'll be okay. There's nothing going to happen to me. And maybe he had a little bit of a fatalistic aspect to him. That may be fair to say about Lincoln. Well, anyways, Abraham Lincoln, though, is when he is going to get caught up in the Booth conspiracy, first thing to remember is Booth and Lincoln had met on at least one occasion, maybe several occasions. And so Lincoln, by the way, was a famous and a wonderful friend of Lincoln was a famous friend of the theater. He went to Ford's Theater. He loved the theater. Lincoln was never a particularly observant Christian, and at times you may find Lincoln going to a theater instead of church. Someone said to me recently, we were talking about this, and I said, that statement right there, and this person said back to me, it's like, what, he may have also been trying to get away from Mary Todd a little bit since she nagged him all the time. And so, maybe that's true too. Lincoln was a celebrity, and any president to some degree is a celebrity, even ones that are not liked by one part of the country. They're a celebrity because the other part likes the guy. Lincoln was a celebrity because he's the president, and he liked to meet actors. And the actors generally liked to meet him. And so after a play was over, Lincoln would send down a note, maybe during the play would send a note and have it posted in the actor's suite and invite the man up to meet the president. The president wanted to speak to him. It was kind of one of those sorts of celebrity elbow-rubbing operations. You see this today. President Obama would rub elbows with some sports celebrities and other celebrities. You saw a lot of that. You see kind of less of it today just because of the politics between President Trump, and those who are in Hollywood. That's not quite as prominent, but you find Trump rubbing elbows elsewhere. All of which is to say is back to Lincoln, he was a known quantity there. Lincoln on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, is going to go or ask for tickets to Ford's Theater to see a play at a comedy called Our American Cousin. It was a common comedy. It was a well-known comedy. It was a funny comedy for the time period. Had a lot of laugh lines and so forth. And Lincoln in April of 65 was at the height of his popularity. The mythology was starting to grow up around him, and it's going to grow even more, of course, when Lincoln dies. The thing is that Lincoln asked for tickets. Of course, he receives it for the presidential box. The box office of the owners of Ford's Theater put out word on the streets that the president will be there, so that drives ticket sales. It is a packed house with the president, the first lady, and some of their guests there in the presidential box at Ford's Theater. And Booth knows this. Booth knows all this sort of stuff because it's just common open knowledge. So Booth kicks his awful plan into motion, and he sets his conspirators loose to go get their targets. And most of them couldn't do it. One got drunk and passed out. Another guy took a shot and missed. Another fella winged the Secretary of State, and on we could go. But Booth was the most committed and the most competent to pull this off. If you read through American assassination history, you end up finding out a lot of the assassins seem to be lucky, and I don't mean this in some sort of lucky sort of way. I mean like a conspiracy. But a lot of the assassins are, the bullet finding the mark sort of thing. And how did it happen? Well, it's fate, I guess, or something like that. Anyways, all of which is to say, Booth, who himself was not exactly a crack shot, and is not exactly what I would call a marksman and a trained assassin. He is certainly more of a aspirational assassin. Booth goes to Ford's Theater, and he enters the theater about 30 minutes or so after the play had started. It was well underway. The lights were out. It was dark. And Booth starts to make his way through the theater, kind of slithering through the crowd. people walking by. That's not unusual. Some people recognize Booth. They're like, okay, it's Booth, but he's always in and around there. He's a creature of the play, of the theater. So, and Booth also knew the play too. He had it memorized, so he knew the applause lines. Booth goes down to the landing, the stairwell on the landing that would allow him to go up and ascend to the presidential platform or the presidential box there at Ford's Theater. And the doorkeeper basically saw Booth, and Booth is a celebrity. They all knew him. And Booth said, the president has asked to see me, and he showed him his card. And, of course, Booth had done that before, meaning he'd seen the president. The president had done that with other actors, so this doorkeeper's like, okay, fine, head on up there. And so Booth goes on up, and he stalks the president. He stalks his prey. He gets into the box, and he slips up behind the president with a poker pistol. It's a little Derringer. It's a little single-shot Derringer that is about as potent. It's not accurate at all. In fact, if you talk about this little single-shot Derringer-style pistol, Booth picked probably one of the worst weapons he could have used, and everything had to go just right for him to have killed the president, and it does, of course. But Booth couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn at more than about 25 feet. It was that inaccurate. It was also so weak that at 25 feet, there's a good chance the bullet bounces off of the president's skull. But Booth, who was lucky, and he was also good enough, he also had a big Bowie knife with him sharpened to the hilt. He slips up behind the president, pulls the trigger, snap, bang, hits Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln pitches forward and falls out of the chair. And this is all happening like this. One of Lincoln's companions, a colonel in the Army, reaches up to attack and to accost and to hold Booth down. Booth produces the blade, produces the Bowie knife, slashes the man down to the bone, and then Booth, who's got a horse saddled on the backside, ready to run out on the backside of the theater, Booth is spurred and ready to go. He jumps up on the railing there in the booth, the presidential box, jumps off, catching his heel, so he falls awkwardly, and he lands on the stage. He breaks his leg, and he says these very famous words, "Sic semper tyrannis," death to tyrants, thus always to tyrants. So, anyways, that, by the way, is the state motto of Virginia, "Sic semper tyrannis," and it's also Booth's words as he staggers out the door with that now broken leg, and he's going to ride off, and eventually he's going to get caught days later, about a week later, and he dies in the attempt. Dies either by bullet or by fire. It's some murkiness there, but Booth dies shortly thereafter. The rest of his conspirators are caught, and some of the people who were just in the room but really weren't conspirators, they were just simply there. They're going to get caught up in the wash too, and all of them will be hung. And so when you talk about the retribution of the war, there was, in many respects, especially since they messed up the hanging, some of those guys kicked for half an hour when they weren't supposed to. Any retribution Northerners had for Southerners in saying we need to punish the South violently and harshly was that appetite was slacked by the Surratt hangings and the Booth conspiracy hangings. It was a fiasco on the Northern side. Lincoln is going to die the next day. They take him across the street. Some of you've seen the house where he was held at. One of the men who's standing in the room with Lincoln, who had called Lincoln just a fool and an idiot and treated him horribly early on, but had come to respect and love him in a sense, and as much as he probably loved anybody, and that was Edwin Stanton, really great Secretary of War. Stanton is standing there around the bed with the other cabinet members who were able to get there after the assassination attempts. Mary Todd had been ushered from the room. She's crying hysterically down on the floor, and then Lincoln dies the next morning, and basically and Stanton says, now he belongs to the ages. And Lincoln is no more. It's kind of amazing that he lived as long as he did, considering the bullet pierced his skull, pierced his brain, and lodged up against the forehead. But Lincoln is no more. And so, in a sense, Lincoln historically is going to go out at the right time. Obviously, he does not wish to be shot and killed. He had other things to do. But sometimes timing is everything, and so he goes out, and he is the beloved and great beloved and great Abraham Lincoln. The mythology and all the stuff that had been growing around him, especially at the end of the war, now just goes into full flower. And his funeral is a gigantic and a tumultuous affair. And that's where we'll pick up in the next lecture, the funeral of Lincoln and the inauguration of the new president, Andrew Johnson.